That I just came back from was a trip that was sponsored by the University of Maryland. I was not a tourist. We actually are not allowed to be tourists yet, but I was an officially permitted visitor. And the trip was intended to help in growing a strategy for Cuban economic development after the recent political developments that have, thawed relationships between the U.S. and Cuba. I had been there twice before with Irv in the early 2000s, so that was my own point of comparison. At that time, Irv and I stayed in the same hotel where my parents had spent their honeymoon in 1941, the Hotel Inglaterra. Thanks, Mom, for getting me oriented towards Cuba early. When Irv and I went, the furniture and plumbing in the hotel appeared to be still intact from the 1940s. Medical care and education were remarkable. This underdeveloped country had achieved social gains comparable to developed countries in healthcare, education, and athletics. But ordinary material goods were lacking, and there appeared to be little freedom to travel together in civic groups, to exercise free speech, and to practice religion. Access to the internet was limited and sub rosa. Someone who worked in an office might have access, and after hours there would be unofficial use. Just a little march back in time. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, there was a brief period when democracy seemed to be a possibility. But Castro quickly showed allegiance to the Soviet Union rather than Ed Sullivan and American values. And he was rewarded by many years of economic and cultural support, especially helpful in producing striking achievements in education, medical services, and athletic excellence. I've talked to children who grew up during those years who talk about the great optimism of their generation, the commitment to the collective welfare, and the uplift of material circumstances for many families. Of course, other families experienced a decline in status and material resources, and many experienced the very worst of totalitarian rule. With the devolution of the Soviet Union at the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s, their economic support was withdrawn and genuine hardship grew. Through the years, the U.S. imposed a variety of economic sanctions, which further prevented ordinary business operations and financial practices. I was interested to see how things had changed since Irv and I were there 15 years ago, and this trip offered a great possibility. There were 16 professors from all around the United States, and these were our objectives. That's what the program was advertised as. And as I said, it was sponsored by the University of Maryland. And I understand that they had this group all assembled, and they realized they didn't have anybody from Miami, and they actually reached out to find me to go with them. Thank you, taxpayers of America, for supporting our efforts to make things better. Probably the state of Florida contributed something too. But we stayed at the famous Hotel Nacional, that old Meyer Lansky hotel of mafia days. That's a small picture there. But here we are checking in. This is a bigger picture. It looks a lot like the Biltmore Hotel in Coral Gables. My room was on the historic second floor, right next to the old mafia suite, and it appeared to be little changed since those days. We did get CNN and the Weather Channel on the hotel television, but internet was really difficult, so I was incommunicado all that time, as Irv and my mother experienced, but they took good care of one another. Ordinary Cubans are restricted to Cuban television, which is government controlled, but those with a little money buy something called the paquete, which is a terabyte of data movies, games, Univision, newspapers from around the world, all sorts of things, put together by 4 anonymous magicians and personally delivered every week sub rosa by young entrepreneurs for $2 or $3 each week. This is not exactly legal, but the government is tolerating it for the time being. In the early 2000s, I remember many Cubans said socialist structures and practices had become sufficiently institutionalized to survive the transition that would occur with the passing of the revolutionary generation. Private business was barely tolerated. We saw a shoemaker recycling old tires into sandals and a tray with 6 homemade cakes for sale on the sidewalk. Another small picture, but you get the general perspective there. But that was about all the free enterprise we saw. We had the freedom to take authorized tours from 4 tourist companies, all government-owned and supervised closely. However, many people were afraid to talk to Americans when Irv and I were there. They would look over their shoulders before engaging in a conversation. The gesture of stroking a beard represented, "Be careful, someone may be watching, listening, reporting." We saw it dozens of times. Raul Castro succeeded Fidel Castro in 2008, and for several years the cult of Fidelismo continued at a relatively high level, with little deviation from established economic and political tendencies. Venezuela, benefiting from the high price of petroleum, provided Cuba with economic support. However, in 2011, important changes began, the changes that this academic program that I was just on was supposed to help us understand. One of the Cuban academics we met explained that from a socialist perspective, actually the highest level of capitalistic economic development had never been achieved in Cuba, so the socialist revolution had been compromised from the beginning. Our group, operating from a more capitalistic perspective, thought the economic isolation resulting from the political dissolution of the Soviet Empire produced an economic and political system on a downward trajectory. Our group traveled from Havana to Cienfuegos, an old French colonial city, first populated by plantation owners fleeing Haiti in the 1700s when slavery ended there. And then on to Trinidad, a seaside city showing many African influences, even in the local dialect. They take Bantu words and make them Spanish by adding an IA on the end or an EN on the beginning. It's very interesting. We traveled in a comfortable air-conditioned tour bus. But contrasts between the visitor's economy and the economy of most Cubans were clear to see. We were well provisioned. Here is an example of the kinds of places we went to eat. Even though we were heavily organized and controlled, we did see the other side of Cuba, like this. It was evident that a government plan has been created for tolerating, even encouraging, a limited degree of private business. A little more personal freedom is possible, although the consequences of it are still kind of unpredictable. In January 2016, we were told a directive had come down that gave more latitude for Cubans to talk with visiting Americans. That old gesture that meant someone might be watching, stroking the imaginary beard, is seldom seen now. The arts are flowering. Artistic expression is something that can flourish even with little material investment or infrastructure development. The present Cuban government has extensive plans for economic development, for example, in the areas of tourism and biotechnology. A massive economic development zone is projected at Mariel, west of Havana. Students are now being encouraged to consider education for the trades rather than focusing exclusively on university-level education. Guaranteed food rations are being reduced, with the expectation that this will push Cubans into entrepreneurial activities and make them less dependent on the government. The creativity and the educational level of the population are real, but they have to work so hard to find what they need to work with, or even to live, that it constitutes a tremendous overhead. A government that restricts access to modern information systems, as the present government still does, cannot expect its scientists and engineers to be very productive. Companies wanting to invest in bulldozers or backhoes or cherry picker trucks have to apply for government permission and compete with entities needing social goods like ambulances or agricultural equipment. Allocation of very scarce resources is presently controlled by a multiplicity of officials representing various government bureaus and levels of decision-making. The availability of anything you can think of, from basic foodstuffs to scientific instruments, is limited, unpredictable, and subject to innumerable approvals by various authorities. Every day, several plane loads arrive in Havana with large blue bundles containing clothes, tools, medicines, and other necessities of life brought in by family members living outside of Cuba. Remittances, money sent back home by immigrants to keep their families going, provide just enough to keep them going. But the economic development of Cuba cannot be based on big blue bundles. The government has plans for big hotels and big cargo ships bringing in things for the big hotels, and big showers and flush toilets. But with the current level of infrastructure and supply systems in Cuba, these plans seem unlikely to succeed anytime soon. Human resources are employed in a distorted way. With Cuban private enterprise, workers are farmed out by the government to companies, then their pay goes to the state, and the state gives workers a salary of about $20 a month. The Cuban government makes magnificent plans, including literally hundreds of prioritized goals like luxury hotels and biotech research institutes. But it seems they have forgotten to plan for reliable agricultural supplies or a dependable water or sanitary system, which in any event is a bit difficult when your most ambitious and talented engineers are mixing mojito frappes for visitors, and that way making more than $20 a month, much more. Educators become tour directors, spinning tales, real and improvised, to get tips from visitors. Physical therapists sell souvenirs in the market. Young professionals peddle the paquete underground. Many of the young and talented manage to go abroad, like my acquaintance, who's a doctor in Cuba but a housekeeper in Miami. Another friend got a glimpse of other countries in international athletic competitions, and after a 6-year effort managed to get to Miami and become a private trainer. His brother tried 22 times to cross the Florida Straits by raft, getting caught and returned every time. Finally, his family scraped together enough money to pay a smuggler to get him out of Cuba. My husband's doctor came to the U.S. as a penniless teenager and managed to finish high school, go to Harvard, and become a brain surgeon. If my experience is any guide, American visitors going to Cuba these days are spared from the cruel reality of life for most ordinary Cubans. Let me give you an example. I had the experience of escorting one of our party, an older gentleman with a very sore throat, you will see him later in this presentation, to the hospital where the Hotel Nacional sends its guests at 4 a.m. I was considered the one of our party who had the most experience in taking elderly gentlemen to the hospital. We arrived by taxi, were greeted by a worker standing by, and escorted to the emergency room, where a receptionist took the details of his passport. He was immediately taken to an examination room, clean as could be, but with minimal equipment, just a desk, scales, chairs, and an examination table. A doctor diagnosed a sore throat due to acid reflux, advised him to lose weight, wrote out a prescription, and had a nurse give him a big shot that made him feel better very quickly. Another doctor appeared to be standing by in the hallway. A pharmacist with an assistant opened up the pharmacy and dispensed some pills. Then there was a cashier to collect a total of about $45 for the visit, the medicine, and the doctor's services. There was no computer in sight, nor any laboratory facilities, but the place was clean and in good repair. The basic care was excellent, and he felt better the next day. He was the only patient there. This is the Cuba seen by the current crop of American visitors. In contrast, one Cuban-American friend living in Miami tells me about taking her nephew in Cuba to a theme park, the Lennon Park, where he had an accident that gave him a cut on the head. There was no 911 service, so a taxi took them to the hospital, available to ordinary Cubans. He got 14 stitches. They hooked up an IV line from a rusty stand with a roach crawling on it. Since he had to remain in the hospital for a few days, his family had to bring sheets and food from home and pay for his medicine out of their $20 monthly income. This is the Cuba of actual Cubans and extends beyond medicine to every other area of the economy, including agriculture. And this, to me, just represents the lack of development. I did see gardens, and our group was taken to an organic garden, which then served lunch, but I didn't see any barns raising chickens or any large-scale agricultural production at all. And whenever we asked a question about agriculture, the answer was invariably, it's complicated. Relatives outside of Cuba contract to have deliveries of money, medicines, toiletries, meat, and other foodstuffs delivered to their relatives there. Whatever economic development there might be has been largely financed by remittances from abroad, not a sustainable model for the large-scale plans put forward by the government. Many of these plans and projections impress me as similar to the magical realism of some of the greatest Latin American fiction, where real and imaginary elements are intertwined, the future is confused with the present and the past, and there are fantastical elements, like little fish that turn to gold coins and vice versa. Before many American tourists and businesses come, you have to have dependable running water and flushing toilets that exist in reality, not just in a planning document. But so far, Cuba has managed to stifle businesses trying to operate efficiently in the present day by requiring numerous official approvals for any kind of expansion and state orders whereby the first 20% or so of production goes to a specified government target. Thus, an agricultural enterprise or an ice cream manufacturer has to deliver a free quota to a hospital or a school before any is available for sale. Private ownership from abroad is limited to a minority stake. Control still rests with the government, banks do not function, and foreign expertise is limited to 1 or 2 managers per enterprise at the most. Granted, this fosters a culture of creativity and innovation. For example, one man, an actual Cuban, not an imaginary one, steals the little shopping bags that are supposed to be used to deliver the goods his factory produces. He then trades them to school children for scraps of food left over from their state-provided lunches. Then he feeds the scraps to his own private pig, which then becomes available for the family's consumption. This is the reality for ordinary Cubans, seldom seen or even heard about by visiting dignitaries and academics. The socialistic ideals that created widespread educational opportunity, good health, and athletic excellence bring promise that the Cuban people themselves can develop the economy when their innate talents are loosened, as they have been in Miami and elsewhere. But this requires capital investment, integration in international financial circles, and official accommodation to capitalism at a level which has yet to be demonstrated despite recent pronouncements. International investors are willing and even eager to give Cuba access to the resources needed for sustainable economic development. But true accommodation will require loosening the power of both Cuban officialdom and the many obstructive laws and regulations imposed by the United States and other international actors. All of this will take time. I estimate a long time. I will conclude by letting one of my colleagues from the trip give his assessment of the situation.
Well, if they want tourism, they have to be able to accommodate the tourists in and out. They have 2 arrival gates, 2 departure gates. They don't have good communication. They don't have good security. They don't have it organized where people get in and go, etc. They have no jetways whatsoever. Their landing capacity is pretty limited, and they're planning on bringing 20, 30 jets in a day. They can't deal with that kind of capacity. They just don't have the facility. We've been here for 3 hours, and there have been 2 flights. Now, they're going to have to double that, triple that, to be able to accommodate what they want to do. Can't do it. Case closed.
Thank you very much for coming today and for helping me to organize my thoughts